Hello, and welcome to another Visual C# tutorial. So far, we've mostly worked with forms and written a little bit of code behind the forms in response to button clicks and clicking on images and things like that. But what happens when we want to work with information that isn't visibly on the form? Something I want to hold in the background and keep for later and do something with. Now, what might an example of that be? Here's a simple application where imagine I'm in a role-playing game and I have a backpack, and the backpack contains items. So if I click on it in this imaginary game, the items that are in the backpack show up, and I can choose one of them. So I chose a hammer. Now, there's nowhere on my form right now where I keep track of the fact that I chose that hammer, but my program still needs to know that because perhaps the next action I take will change depending on whether I have a hammer or a scroll or a gem in my hand at that time. So where do we keep this information? How do we work with it if we don't put it on a form? And to prove to you that I do know what was chosen, I can click this button here that says, "What did I choose?" And it says, "You chose hammer." And if I pick a different item from the backpack and I pick a gem and I click "What did I choose?" it says you chose gem. So we're keeping this information around somewhere. If it's not on the form, where are we tracking the fact that the user chose a gem or a hammer or a scroll? And the tool we use to do that is called a variable. So let me close this out and let's go look at the code inside of this application. And don't worry too much about how the application itself works. Mostly I want to focus on where we use variables in the application. So a variable is simply a named container, not unlike putting a label on your form or a picture on your form. It has a name, and you're assigning that item on the form some text, or you're assigning it an image to display, you're telling it that it's a button, whatever it might be. We have this concept already of a container that holds information. And in this case, the container isn't on my form, it's simply in my code. It's in the program itself. And here's an example of using a variable. In this case, I want to store a string. I want to store the name of the thing that I picked on that form. And it's either going to be hammer, scroll, or gem. And so I'm going to take this container, I'm going to call it my item. That's what a variable is. It's just a container with a name. And I'm going to say my item equals quote, nothing, quote. In this particular case, that's what I want to have in that variable if the user hasn't chosen anything out of the backpack yet. So I'm just going to start off by saying, hey, C#, I have a string. I have a container that's going to contain a string. I want to call it my item. And I want to start it out by putting the word nothing, the string nothing, in it. And so now I have this thing called my item. And later in my code, I can say things like messagebox.show my item, and it will say hammer, or in this case, it will say nothing. So my item is essentially a placeholder, a symbol, if you will, that holds whatever information that I want. And in this case, it's a string. So how do I use it? What does this mean? If I go down farther in the program and I look at what happens when I actually click on one of these buttons, here's the button that I click to select a scroll, and here's the button that I click to select a gem. As soon as the user clicks on the scroll button, the first thing that I do is I take my item and I assign the word scroll to it, in quotes, because it's a string. So my item now contains the word scroll. And if I click the gem, the code says, oh, you click the gem, my item is now going to equal gem. So you're just using it as a container, a holder, a variable that you're going to include in your program that you can then use later on. So what I did later on is I have a button, I called it choose button. This is the one on my form where I say, what did I choose? If I click that button, then this code runs. I take the label that's below it and I say, oh, we'll make its text say, you chose something. And if I want to know what the something is that you chose, it's right here. It's my item. So I can say you chose plus my item, and it will actually show that information on the screen. And we'll look at other examples going forward. This is a simple one where I have a string. I can put whatever I want in it. I can change it. I can say my item equals Fred in quotes if I'd like. It's a flexible container. And so this is an example of a string variable and how I might want to use it in an application. I hope that was helpful. Thank you.